This is part 1 of my video series on Chapter 17, SEM II, Confirmatory Factor Analysis. This will be a multi-part video series on my chapter, telling my students what they need to know about this chapter to get ready for the multiple choice quiz, to get ready for the small group discussion exercise, etc. On page 2 of the chapter, we have this, the basics of this procedure. Confirmatory factor analysis, CFA, allows researchers to investigate the factor structure underlying a set of manifest variables. A factor structure is a type of causal model which hypothesizes the number of factors being measured by a set of manifest variables, which specific manifest variables are measuring each factor, and related issues. As an example, if you're in my class, I will have sent to you something called, let's go back to page 1. If you're in my class, I will have sent to you something called Psych 400, Additional Exhibits for Chapter 17, SEM 1. That should say SEM II, version 1. The following figure appears on page 4 of Chapter 17, SEM II, Confirmatory Factor Analysis. This is an example of a factor structure. This is an example of a causal model that illustrates the relationship between underlying factors and the manifest variables that measure them. Now, we'll get into the details of this in a minute, but just to give you a quick introduction, notice this oval. It is labeled exercise behavior. That is a latent factor. It's being measured by 2 items on the questionnaire. The 2 items on the questionnaire are illustrated by these 2 squares. It's being measured by item V76 on the questionnaire and V79 on the questionnaire. Here's another oval. This oval is labeled health motivation. That's another underlying factor. It's being measured by questionnaire items V27, V28, and V29. That's another factor. If you take this all together, it's a factor structure. It illustrates the number of factors that are being measured by a questionnaire, which specific questionnaire items are measuring which factor, what are the relationships between these factors. We'll get into the details of this causal model soon. Going back to the chapter, factor structure is a type of causal model which hypothesizes the number of factors being measured by a set of manifest variables, which specific manifest variables are measuring each factor and related issues. We illustrated that. Let's go to my specific illustrative example that'll be the focus of this chapter. Many of the earlier chapters in this book discussed something called the 4-factor model of exercise behavior. We now move to the 6-factor model of exercise behavior. Let's imagine that our fictitious Dr. O'Day now revises this theoretical framework, expanding it into something that we'll call the 6-factor model of exercise behavior. The revised measurement model now includes the following 6 constructs. Not 4 constructs, but now we're up to 6. First of all, it's going to include a factor called exercise behavior. Yes, exercise behavior is a new construct, a new factor. Health motivation, that was one of the factors that was included in our previous 4-factor model. Dislike of exercise was one of the factors included in the previous 4-factor model. Desire to be thin, that's one of our previous ones. But here's a new one, current health. Current health is a new construct. Lack of time for exercise, that's one of our old constructs. Taken together, this is our 6-factor model of exercise behavior. Eventually, Dr. O'Day would like to perform another path analysis in which she tests a causal model that hypothesizes specific causal relationships between these 6 variables. This path analysis will be somewhat similar to the one performed in Chapter 16, with the exception that this time the variables in the causal model will be latent factors instead of manifest variables. Now, what do we mean by this? Let's go to that handout that I'm sending to everybody in my class, the handout that's called P400 additional exhibits for Chapter 17. Let's skip past the first one and let's go to the second figure that appears in that handout that I've sent to everybody in my class. The following appeared on page 4 of Chapter 16, SEM I, Path Analysis with Manifest Variables. This is the kind of simple path analysis that you learned about back in Chapter 16. In Chapter 16, you perform path analysis to determine whether there's likely causal relationship between a set of manifest variables. Manifest variables are represented by the squares in this model. You'll recall that the model that we initially tested hypothesized that exercise sessions was causally determined by health motivation and dislike of exercise. It predicted that health motivation was causally determined by desire to be thin and current health and so forth. This is the kind of path analysis we performed in Chapter 16. Now, eventually, you're going to go on to Chapter 18. We're not going to cover Chapter 18 this semester. We lost one chapter due to factors beyond our control, but you still have Chapter 18 in your course pack, and it will show how you can expand this kind of simple path analysis to something more sophisticated. On the next page of the handout I'm sending to everybody in my class, we have this. Following figure appears on page 4 of Chapter 18, SEM III, Path Analysis with Latent Factors. This is essentially the same causal model that was illustrated in Chapter 16, except now the variables that make up the causal model are ovals instead of squares. The fact that they're ovals mean that we're no longer considering these variables to be manifest variables. Instead, they are latent factors. They are underlying factors measured using the kind of technology that we use to perform path analysis. Notice that my ultimate outcome variable is exercise behavior. It's no longer enclosed by a square. Instead, it's enclosed by an oval. That means we're treating it as a latent factor. This latent factor, exercise behavior, is once again predicted to be causally determined by health motivation. Notice it's an oval, meaning it's a factor. And dislike of exercise. Notice it's an oval. Once again, health motivation is predicted to be determined by desire to be thin and current health. So it's essentially the same causal model that we looked at before, except now the factors that make up, the variables that make up the causal chain are latent factors. Now, if it's a latent factor, that means it must be measured by some kind of observed variable, some kind of manifest variable, and that is the case. Exercise behavior is measured by questionnaire items 76 and 79 on the questionnaire. Health motivation is measured by questionnaire items 27, 28, and 29 on the questionnaire. When you read Chapter 18, you'll learn how to do this kind of path analysis with latent factors. But before you can do path analysis with latent factors, you first have to make sure that you're doing a good job of measuring these latent factors, and that's where the current chapter comes in. Chapter 17, Confirmatory Factor Analysis. Let's go back to Chapter 17. This is where we left off. I'm on page 3 of Chapter 17. Is that page 3? Yes. Page 3 of Chapter 17. Let's reread what I just read. Eventually, Dr. O'Day would like to perform another path analysis in which he tests a causal model that hypothesizes specific causal relationships between these 6 variables. This path analysis will be somewhat similar to the one performed in Chapter 16, with the exception this time the variables in the causal model will be latent factors instead of manifest variables. But she's not ready to do that analysis just yet. First, she has to develop an acceptable measurement model. This is a term you'll read a lot in Chapter 17. Measurement model is a factor analytic model which makes specific hypotheses about the number of constructs that she's measuring, which questionnaire items are measuring each construct. If she develops an acceptable measurement model in the current chapter, she'll then be prepared to perform latent factor path analysis in the next chapter. What do you mean measurement model? You've already seen Dr. O'Day's measurement model. Dr. O'Day's measurement model in the current investigation, manifest variables are responses to individual items on a questionnaire. Each latent factor is measured by 2 to 4 of these questionnaire items. items. The proposed factor model, that is the measurement model that Dr. O'Day investigates in this study, is illustrated in figure 17.1. We see that figure on page 4, and this should look familiar. This is the same confirmatory factor analytic model I showed you a minute ago. It's the same 6 factors that you saw in the previous figure. This oval represents the factor for exercise behavior, being measured by these 2 questionnaire items. This oval represents the factor for health motivation, being measured by these 3 questionnaire items. This oval represents the factor for desire to be thin, measured by these 3 questionnaire items. This is the factor analytic model that we're going to investigate in the current chapter. We're going to use confirmatory factor analysis to determine whether this is a good measurement model, whether it produces results with good enough fit that we'll feel okay about going on to the next chapter, chapter 18. Well, this is probably a good place for me to end part 1 of the video series. Part 2 of the video series will pick up where we left off on page 4 in the section Conventions Used with Hypothetical CFA Models. This is the end of part 1.